On September 18th, 1873, a worldwide economic retraction begins. This retraction, until 1929, will be known as the Great Depression. To set the scene, we need to understand the world economy before 1873. This places us during the Industrial Revolution, when machines began to overtake physical labor. One of the biggest of these machines was the railroad, which had exploded in usage in the West. In fact, by 1840, the United States had more rail than not only Great Britain, but all of Europe. Railroads were great economically since they allowed farmers and industries to move goods around quickly, but they required huge amounts of investment and land. Now, let's talk about major causes of the Panic of 1873. In July of 1870, France and the soon-to-be Germany, Prussia, fought a war creatively named the Franco-Prussian War. Within a year, Prussia beat the French, and in the following Treaty of Frankfurt, France was forced to pay 5 billion francs in indemnities to Prussia. This is important since it provided German investors with a huge amount of money to invest with, and a lot of this money went to investments in America, specifically American railroads. German investment in American railroads, which was already high, grew uncontrollably. It's important to know, though, that American railroads were already way overspeculated, regardless of German investment. In simpler terms, investors had greatly overestimated the profitability of a railroad, putting too much money into railroads that would not yield great returns. So, the railroad industry was in a bubble, and it was ripe for collapse. Another thing that contributed to the depression was Germany's decision to stop using silver as a monetary metal. Many nations, including the United States, had currency redeemable in both gold and silver. This was in order to give more value to the currency and reduce inflation. For example, if a dollar was fixed to equal an ounce of gold, that would prevent the dollar from losing too much value, because it's pegged to gold, whose value is stable. However, when Germany decided to stop redeeming currency in silver, it meant that there was less incentive to hold silver, and demand for silver dropped, causing a drop in silver's value as well. However, because the United States and other nations had fixed their exchange rate, when the value of silver fell, the value of their currency fell too, causing inflation. So, the US and many other nations, to the chagrin of many silver miners, decided to demonetize silver and adhere to the gold standard. The fact that there was now less precious metals that could redeem currency sharply contracted the money supply, reducing the amount of credit that was available. This lowered investment and circulation. This issue was compounded when Germany, now a newly born nation, began opening up their economy, increasing German domestic investment while decreasing foreign investment into the United States. Many of these railroads relied on European investment, so this was very bad news for them. Furthermore, investors became fearful of betting on American railroads, which were hugely corrupt. For example, in 1872, the Credit Mobilier scandal came into light, in which railroad builders had overcharged the federal government for profit. Finally, a housing bubble in Europe caused many European economies to go into a recession, diminishing European investment into the United States. These problems all culminated into the Panic of 1873, when Jay Cooke and Company, a bank which had heavily invested into the Northern Pacific Railroad, realized that it had underestimated the railroad's cost. It was unable to find additional investors to cover costs, and promptly the company went bankrupt. Jay Cooke and Company's collapse sent shockwaves down Wall Street. Other investment firms realized that their railroad investments may have been dangerous, and facing a similar situation, they collapsed. Hearing about this panic, people rushed to get their money from banks, but the price fall meant that banks were losing money from their investments. When banks couldn't catch up with withdrawal demands, they failed. And when the banks fail, so do businesses. See, without any banks, businessmen couldn't find any loans to expand their businesses with. This was most felt in the railroad industry. Because banks and investors realized that railroad investments were extremely risky, investments into new rail grinded to a halt. With railroads and businesses unable to get more money, unemployment surged. To try to stop the crisis, the government announced it would buy $10 million in bonds, hoping that the expanded money supply would increase confidence. It didn't. With the economy continuing to tank, the New York Stock Exchange stopped trading for the first time in history on September 20th, 1873. This recession lasted from 1873 to 1879, but many argue that it lasted for much longer. In America, unemployment hit an all-time high of 14%. 18,000 businesses failed, and almost a quarter of American railroads went bankrupt. In New York City, unemployment hit an all-time high of 25%. Words like tramp and bum emerged during this time period. Hard hit were the veterans, who now had trouble finding employment. but it was worst for the industrial workers. With falling profits, manufacturing businesses and factories laid off workers and slashed wages. Strikes flashed throughout the country, often turning violent. In July 1877, when a West Virginian railway company announced it would be yet again cutting wages, railroad workers blocked trains in protest. Angry factory workers, also facing harsh wage cuts, joined in the strike. Soon, the whole country was in protest. This strike, the aptly named Great Railroad Strike of 1877, was so powerful that it stopped almost half of all freight trains in the United States. To quash the strike, the government sent troops. During the chaos, close to 100 died, and 1,000 were arrested. These strikes had an important long-term consequence. Reading about the violence of these workers, support dipped for unions and workers' rights. Businessmen used this opportunity to blame workers, and important unions like the Knights of Labor lost public sympathy. However, perhaps the most consequential effect of the Panic of 1873 was that it led to the end of the Reconstruction period. After the Civil War, in order to expand the rights of black freedmen, Congress had passed many amendments and legislature. Among these were the right to vote and political equality for black freedmen. Many in the South despised these laws and resorted to violence and intimidation to keep black freedmen subjugated. One especially prevalent group was the Ku Klux Klan. This group terrorized blacks in the South, intimidating them to prevent them from voting. To counteract this violence, Congress passed the Force Acts, which allowed federal troops to occupy the South in order to enforce equality laws and protect freedmen. Congress was able to pass this since the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln in the North, was extremely popular after they won the war. Additionally, many Southern Democratic states were still in the process of regaining statehood. So, for more than a decade, the Republican Party basically controlled Congress. However, when the Depression started in 1873, it struck a huge blow to the Republican Party. Republicans were blamed for the failure, and the next election, unlike previous ones, was hotly contested. In the election, Republican candidate Rutherford Hayes, though losing the popular vote by more than 200,000 votes, had roughly the same amount of electoral votes as Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden. To get Hayes elected, the Republicans and Democrats struck a deal. In exchange for Hayes' presidency, they agreed to remove troops from the South, ending Reconstruction. This move had far-reaching consequences in the South. The KKK, which had been gasping its last breath, was revitalized, and now free to roam, lynch, and intimidate. With the KKK and Jim Crow laws preventing blacks from voting, white Southern Democrats retook the government and passed laws that greatly hurt the poor blacks. In the end, the Panic of 1873 took 2 decades to fully recover from. Although its consequences were significant, perhaps more interesting is how it changed the perception of economics. Never had the world experienced such a prolonged, wide-ranging depression. Given its severity, many gave it the name the Great Depression. Of course, in 1929, a new depression began that would be far more brutal.